The city of Eastmere glistened like a crown jewel along the coast, where glass skyscrapers kissed the clouds, and the ocean breeze carried the scent of money and old power. But hidden behind the elegance was a rhythm few heard, a quiet beat of sacrifice playing beneath luxury's surface. And every night, inside the shimmering heart of that wealth, the restaurant Bellevue, that rhythm walked in the form of a young black waitress named Janelle Brooks. Bellevue wasn't just a restaurant. It was theater, a cathedral of opulence wrapped in golden accents and polished floors, where millionaires sipped 100-year-old wine and spoke in hushed tones about mergers, lawsuits, and yachts. The chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls above crisp white linens. The walls were lined with mirrors that made every meal feel like a performance. Janelle knew the choreography by heart. Her steps were precise, her hands steady. Her uniform, black, crisp pressed, hid the music in her veins. She moved between tables like a dancer, her eyes always scanning, anticipating needs before anyone voiced them. The guests never knew her name, just miss or waitress, or worse, a snapped finger or a lifted glass. But Janelle never flinched. She wore grace like armor. What they didn't know, couldn't guess, was that she had once been something more. Not just a server of truffle risotto and dry-aged porterhouse, but a rising star at the Carnegie Conservatory. Back then, she wore gowns instead of aprons and played under stage lights instead of chandeliers. Her hands hadn't carried plates, they carried sound. Her professors called her a voice in the dark. She didn't just play piano, she told stories with it. But then life happened. 3 years ago, her world shifted. Her mother, her biggest fan, her constant audience in the third row, fell ill. Something rare, something cruel. Treatments were endless. Bills piled up like unopened fan mail. And the Carnegie dream, as bright as it once had been, had no room for full-time caretaking and financial pressure. So Janelle walked away. No tantrum, no farewell concert, just quiet resolve, a different kind of music. Now, every night at Bellevue, she played a different role, one that paid, one that allowed her to be home during the day, to administer meds, to sit beside a woman who barely remembered her own name, but still smiled when she heard Chopin from an old speaker. Her talent, once praised, once nurtured, now lived in silence, like a caged bird, but she couldn't help it. Every time she passed the grand piano in the corner of the dining room, she paused, just for a moment. Her eyes would trace the polished black surface, the ivory keys catching the candlelight like little teeth waiting to bite. And then she'd move on, tray in hand, orders in mind. But the longing was there. Always. The other servers noticed. They never asked. Maybe they thought she just liked the look of it. Maybe they didn't care. Bellevue wasn't the kind of place where people shared backstories. It was about surfaces, glossy, curated, efficient. You didn't need dreams. You needed speed. Yet Janelle's body betrayed her. The way she stood straighter near the instrument. The way her hand would flex slightly, reflexively, when a pianist struck a wrong note during dinner sets. She never said a word. But the music hadn't left her. It lived in her muscle memory. In the silent counts she used to time her movements. In the aching stillness between shifts. Tonight, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Bellevue prepared for another performance. Tables were triple booked. A senator had a corner booth. A CEO from Dubai had sent his assistant ahead to request minimal eye contact from the staff. And the grand piano stood silent, its usual performer having called out with a stomach flu. Janelle, as always, arrived early. She tied her hair back tight, checked her apron, slid on her service shoes. And just before the doors opened, she paused beside the piano. Her fingers hovered an inch above the keys, not touching, just remembering. 3 years, no practice rooms, no recitals, no applause, just silence. The maitre d' called her name. She blinked, withdrew her hand, and turned to begin her rounds. Tonight was just another shift, just more steak, more champagne, more invisible labor. But in the corner of the reservation list, beneath the senator and above the CO, a name was scrawled hastily in pen. Dominic Langston, table for 8:30 p.m. And Janelle, who didn't recognize the name, who had never read the tabloid articles or seen the viral clips, had no idea that this particular millionaire, this arrogant tech king, was about to flip her world inside out. Not because he was cruel, not just because he was drunk, but because he would try to use her talent as a punchline. He would dare her to play piano as a joke. And what happened next would leave the entire room and the world beyond in stunned silence. A silence that would be shattered by sound, by soul, by a black waitress who still had music in her blood and a reckoning in her hands. Every evening at Bellevue followed the same choreography, a refined ballet of silver trays, murmured orders, and the flicker of candlelight dancing across mirrored walls. But amid the routine, there was always a moment, almost imperceptible, when Janelle Brooks would slow her pace near the grand piano. It sat in a corner of the dining room like a sleeping monarch, its ebony surface polished to a mirror sheen, the Steinway logo faintly catching the glow of the chandeliers above. Most nights, no one noticed her lingering glance. The way her eyes would rest on the keys with a softness that didn't belong in a place built on precision. She never touched it, never let her fingers brush the bench. But the pause was there, consistent, measured, private. No one asked about it. Not the maitre d', who appreciated her punctuality but kept his concerns buried under professionalism. Not the other servers, who considered her dependable but enigmatic. And certainly not the guests, whose attention rarely strayed from their foie gras or vintage Bordeaux. But if anyone had cared to look closer, they might have noticed the reverence in the way Janelle's gaze lingered on the piano, like someone staring at a locked door they once had the key to. The truth was, she hadn't played in 3 years. Before the uniforms, before the trays, before the half-hour subway ride home to a mother hooked to 4 tubes in a lavender-scented apartment, there had been another life. One filled with sonatas and critiques, recitals and relentless rehearsals. Her world then was Carnegie Conservatory, a temple of classical music where her professors whispered phrases like gifted beyond her years and a spirit that plays through her fingers. And for a while, she believed it. She believed she could command rooms with her playing. She believed the calluses on her fingertips and the aches in her wrists were steps on the path to greatness. She believed music could carry her and her mother into a different life, until her mother collapsed one morning in their kitchen, halfway through making French toast. The diagnosis was swift and cruel. Multiple sclerosis, late stage, aggressive. Janelle's world of etudes and master classes dissolved overnight. Scholarships didn't pay for in-home care. Applause couldn't refill prescription bottles. She dropped out after that semester, quietly, without a farewell recital. Now, her hands bore no calluses, just a faint red lines from carrying trays too long. Her fingers moved with precision still, but it was a different rhythm, lifting crystal glassware, not crafting melodies. She never told her co-workers she could play, never shared that she once stood on a stage and moved a room of strangers to tears. It didn't seem relevant anymore, not when every day was about surviving, budgeting, stretching time and money thin enough to cover her mother's needs. But that piano, it sat there every night, half ignored, a monument to the life she left behind. On quiet shifts, when the room buzzed with soft laughter and the pianist played something familiar, Debussy, usually, she'd find herself pausing beside it just a heartbeat too long. Tonight was one of those nights. There was no pianist. The bench was empty. A pristine, untapped instrument gleamed under soft lights. And Janelle, she stood just a little closer than usual. She knew every inch of that piano's twin at Carnegie. The feel of the lacquer beneath her wrists, the way the pedals hummed under her heel, the slight resistance of the ivory keys. Just enough to remind her that art, like life, demanded both gentleness and strength. She remembered the hours in practice rooms that smelled faintly of dust and would polish. Remember professors pacing behind her, murmuring, "Let the phrase breathe, Janelle, let it speak." Remember the rush of nailing a difficult passage, the trembling after finishing a powerful performance. And she remembered her mother, always in the third row, always with flowers, always smiling like she knew her daughter was meant for something extraordinary. Now her mother barely left the bed. The smile came less often. Janelle ran her fingers along the tray in her hand, the weight of dishes anchoring her to the present. She tore her eyes away from the piano. She couldn't afford to go there, not even in thought. Not when there were tables to serve. Not when rent was due next week. Not when one broken glass could cost her the money she needed for her mother's injections. And yet, the music never left her. It lived in the rhythm of her walk, the cadence of her speech. It echoed in the quiet between rushes, in the way she could read a room and anticipate needs without a word. It existed in the way she noticed beauty in small things. How light refracted through a wine glass, how a spoon resting on a saucer made the softest sound. The music, like the grief, was always there, dormant, coiled, waiting. Tonight, the piano called to her a little louder. Maybe it was the silence of its bench, or the way the chandeliers above shimmered more golden than usual, or the fact that she was tired, bone tired, and that kind of fatigue made the soul ache for something real, something pure, something that reminded you of who you once were before life remade you in its image. So she paused, just for a second, one breath longer than she should have, and somewhere in the corner of the room, someone noticed. The double glass doors of Bellevue flung open at 8:03 p.m. sharp, 15 minutes earlier than expected. A gust of coastal wind swept through the foyer, momentarily chilling the warm, candlelit air. Heads turned, conversations paused, and then he appeared. Dominic Langston, tech magnate, billionaire, media dubbed disruptor of the decade, a man whose wealth built half of Eastmere skyline, and whose ego occupied even more space. He didn't walk in. He arrived, surrounded by 5 men in tailored suits worth more than most people's yearly rent. Langston exuded dominance. Every movement, control calculated, exaggerated. His entourage laughed just a little too loud at his jokes, not a little too fast at his comments. Their eyes roamed the restaurant like they owned it. Perhaps, in a way, they did. Janelle Brooks was resetting table 12 when she heard the hush fall over the room. She didn't look up at first, but she felt the energy shift, the way Bellevue always seemed to breathe differently when someone powerful walked in. She knew that breath. It was shallow, tense, careful. Her colleague Maya brushed past, whispering beneath her breath, "He's here. God help us." Langston had visited Bellevue before. Not often, but when he did, he left a trail. Waiters reduced to tears, managers too terrified to intervene, tips that were both grand and demeaning. He was the kind of millionaire who turned luxury into theater, and every server into a prop in his private drama. Tonight, he was seated at table 5, center of the main floor, equidistant from the bar, the view of the marina, and the grand piano that stood silent against the far wall. The pianist hadn't shown up tonight. A stomach flu, the manager had said, just as well. Langston didn't like to share the spotlight. He leaned back in his chair, ordering 2 bottles of Bellevue's rarest Bordeaux before the menus even hit the table. Janelle, assigned to another section, tried to stay out of view, but it didn't matter. Langston's gaze was sweeping the room, scanning for distractions or opportunities. She could feel his stare before she saw it. Their eyes met for half a second, hers calm, professional, his already laced with something darker. Recognition? No, it wasn't that. Curiosity. And then he turned back to his companions, grinning like a cat that had spotted a mouse across the room. Dominic Langston loved 2 things: dominance and spectacle. He told stories loudly, used names that opened doors, laughed in decibels designed to command attention. And when attention wavered, he stirred the pot. Humiliation, when delivered with a smile, was his favorite dish. "Where's the entertainment tonight?" He asked no one in particular, gesturing to the dark, untouched Steinway. "Pianist sick," a server said, half muttering as they cleared away wine glasses from a nearby table. Langston raised an eyebrow. $1 million piano with no one to play it? What a waste. He sipped his wine, then smirked as his eyes drifted back to Janelle, who had once again paused near the instrument, tray balanced expertly in her hands. She wasn't staring, not really, just glancing, but that was all he needed. He snapped his fingers. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, loud enough for most of the room to hear. "You like that piano?" Janelle stopped mid-step, Her shoulders remained square, but her fingers tightened slightly around the tray. "Yes, sir," she replied, polite but cool. He grinned. "You seem to keep looking at it. You play." Her pause was microscopic. Barely a second. "No, sir," she lied smoothly. Langston chuckled. "Shame. I was about to offer $1,000 for a performance. Even chopsticks would do." Laughter rippled across his table. Nervous, uncertain, Janelle didn't blink. "I'm sure one of our guests could provide more suitable entertainment." Langston leaned forward. But I wasn't asking them. I asked you." It wasn't a request. It was a performance cue. The restaurant held its breath. Other tables tried to pretend they weren't listening, but phones quietly began recording. Servers exchanged looks. The manager stood frozen near the kitchen, clearly debating whether to intervene. Dominic Langston had turned a quiet night into a public stage, and Janelle Brooks into the unwilling lead. He sat back smugly, swirling his glass. "Come on now. $1,000 for a little tune. What's the worst that could happen?" He didn't need to say it. The subtext was deafening. A Black Waitress. Play piano. As a joke. It wasn't about music. It was about power. And she knew it. Her hands trembled, but not with fear. With fury. She offered a small nod, the kind that looked like submission, but wasn't. Inside, something stirred. The silence stretched so tight it might snap, and without a word, Janelle turned toward the piano, her tray still in hand, her face unreadable, her soul whispering. Let them laugh. They don't know what's coming. The grand piano sat in silence that evening. Its black lacquered body gleamed beneath the chandelier's golden hue, untouched. The regular pianist had called in sick last minute. It was unusual for Bellevue, Eastmere's most exclusive coastal restaurant, to go a night without the usual stream of jazz or classical music floating to the marble-lined dining room. From the bar, Janelle Brooks cast a brief glance at the instrument. It wasn't a longing look, just a flicker of a glance, half instinct, half habit. But Dominic Langston saw it. Langston was already 2 glasses deep into his $4,000 bottle of Chateau Margaux, and the energy around his table was electric, if not entirely comfortable. He arrived fashionably late, flanked by 2 tech venture partners and a crypto hedge fund wunderkind barely old enough to shave. He wore his usual tailored arrogance like a bespoke suit, and his laugh carried through the room with the kind of force that made heads turn, even when no one wanted to look. He noticed Janelle's eyes on the piano. His lips curled. "She wants to play," Langston said loud enough for her companions to hear, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Don't you, sweetheart?" Janelle turned, startled. She tried to keep her expression neutral, her posture professional. "Excuse me, sir." He leaned back in his chair, spreading his arms like a king holding court. "The piano," he said. "I saw you looking at it. What's the matter? Think you could do better than our usual guy." His entourage chuckled uneasily. One of the women at a nearby table narrowed her eyes, but said nothing. Janelle smiled faintly, ignoring the bait. "I'm just here to serve, sir," she said. "Oh, come on," he said, pulling out a thick wallet. "Let's make this interesting." He peeled off 10 crisp $100 bills and held them up like an auctioneer. $1,000 if the Black Waitress plays a tune for us. Any tune. Even Twinkle, Twinkle. The room stilled. Janelle felt the air in her lungs seize. Her hand tightened on the wine bottle she'd just uncorked. She could feel her co-workers watching from the corners of the room. She could feel the weight of every phone that had subtly lifted the record. Someone whispered her name. Someone else whispered, "Don't." Langston smiled wider. "What? Too shy? You look curious. Curious enough to touch the keys, at least. Or maybe," he paused, "you think you're too good to just be a waitress?" That landed. A few people looked away. Some frowned. Others simply watched. Morbid curiosity wrapped in fine linen napkins, and $300 entrees. Janelle said nothing. She didn't flinch. She was used to people assuming she was less. But this was more than just a rich man's joke. This was a dare, veiled in mockery, dressed in theater. "Don't make me beg," Langston said, still waving the money like it was bait for a circus trick. "Come on, play piano just for laughs. Just a joke." The word stung. Not because of the money, not even because of the attention, but because of what that piano used to mean to her, and what it no longer did. Her co-workers began to inch toward the back. A junior hostess whispered to the maitre d', who looked unsure whether to intervene. The manager stood frozen near the service station, weighing his next step. Langston wasn't just any millionaire. He was a media darling with connections in every luxury dining magazine and tech outlet in the city. A confrontation with him could cost Bellevue its prestige. Janelle stood in the eye of it all. Her expression didn't change, but inside, memories stirred. The night she had to pack her sheet music away in a cardboard box and leave Carnegie Conservatory. The voicemail she got after the first seizure. Her mother's trembling hands. The moment she knew she couldn't be a musician and a caretaker at the same time. She swallowed hard. Dominic Langston, smug in his throne of leather and wine, leaned in. "How about this?" he said. "Play us a little something, and I'd double it." He slapped down another $1,000 in hundreds. $2,000, he said, "if your fingers still work." It was no longer just a joke. It was a performance he expected her to fail. And that's when it happened. Janelle slowly walked to a side table, placed her tray down with deliberate calm, and straightened her posture. Her hands were steady, her face unreadable. The marble floors clicked beneath her shoes as she turned, without a word, and began walking toward the piano. Gasps rose from a nearby table. Someone whispered, "She's actually going." Langston chuckled and leaned back. Now we've got ourselves a show. But there was something off about her walk. It wasn't timid. It wasn't unsure. It was practiced, measured, as if she wasn't walking toward humiliation. She was walking toward war. The sound of Janelle's heels tapping across the marble floor of Bellevue might as well have been cannon fire. Every step silenced a new table. Every footfall drew more gazes. Glasses froze midair. Conversations ended in half-sentences. Someone dropped a fork. Dominic Langston lounged at his table like a man who thought he was still in control. "Now we're talking," he said with a grin. "This is going to be good." But there was a flicker in his eye, barely visible, that betrayed something else. Confusion. Maybe even discomfort. He wasn't expecting her to take the dare. He was expecting her to shrink. And yet here she was, walking toward a piano like it belonged to her. Janelle reached the bench and didn't sit down right away. She stood beside the instrument, one hand resting lightly on the polished edge. Her face was calm, but her chest rose and fell slightly faster than usual. She could feel every eye on her. Diners, staff, phones quietly recording, and of course, Langston. She turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze. "You said $2,000? She asked quietly. Her voice wasn't confrontational, but it wasn't soft either. It was clear, direct. Langston blinked. "That's right. $2,000. Easy money." She nodded once and turned back to the piano. But inside, her heart was racing. Not because of stage fright. This wasn't recital hall. This wasn't Carnegie. There were no velvet curtains or clapping professors. But the fear felt familiar. It was the fear of stepping back into a life she'd shut away. 1,000 thoughts collided in her mind. Her mother's latest prescription, $6.20 for a month's supply. The rising rent on their tiny apartment. The dented washing machine that shook violently every cycle. $2,000 wasn't a game. It was groceries, medicine, utilities, security. But at what cost? She could feel Langston's condescension crawling up her back like a cold hand. She knew what this was about. It wasn't music. It wasn't interest. It was control. Spectacle. A rich man's entertainment. He didn't think she would play. He didn't believe she could. This was just a performance to him. One where she was supposed to be the punchline. A black waitress being told to play piano as a joke. She closed her eyes. Breathe. Remember. The pressure of a professor's hand on her shoulder. The warmth of applause after her second-year recital. Her mother, clapping from the third row, cheeks wet with tears. "You were born to do this," she had said. "Even when the world doesn't see it, never stop." But the world did stop seeing it. And so had she. Until now. Janelle sat down. The moment her fingers hovered above the keys, her body changed. Her spine straightened. Her chin lifted slightly. A pianist's posture returned like muscle memory. Her hands, those same hands that poured wine in clear plates, trembled only slightly before finding their place. Langston leaned forward. "Play something we know," he called out, his voice breaking the hush. "Let's see what your talent's worth." Janelle didn't answer. Instead, her fingers settled. She took one final breath and let it go. In that silence, a truth bloomed inside her. Yes, the $2,000 mattered. But what mattered more was how she earned it. On her terms. Not as a joke. Not as a servant. Not as a spectacle. But as a musician. As a woman reclaiming her dignity. She pressed a first note. A gentle, lingering B-flat. Then a ripple of arpeggios followed. The restaurant's walls seemed to shift around the sound, as if the building itself was holding its breath. She didn't start with Twinkle, Twinkle, or some beginner tune to amuse a crowd. She began with Chopin's Nocturne in B-flat minor, and it was devastating. The emotion in the opening bars cut to the clink of crystal, the shuffle of expensive shoes, and the smugness of wealth. It cut through Langston's grin, which faltered, then disappeared altogether. This wasn't a waitress fumbling through a child song. This was mastery, and the room knew it. Janelle's fingers flowed across the keys, each note deliberate and alive. Pain, joy, heartbreak, sacrifice, all poured out in perfect tempo. She didn't play at them. She played through them. She became the center of gravity in a room built for people who had never looked her in the eye. Now they couldn't look away. At Langston's table, one of his associates set down his glass without drinking. Another stared at the piano like it had just spoken to him. Langston didn't move. His eyes narrowed, his jaw slightly clenched. He looked around, trying to find a lifeline of laughter or a snide remark to break the moment, but none came. Everyone was too stunned. Janelle's music wasn't just good. It was extraordinary. It was the kind of performance that silences a room, not by force, but by sheer gravity. The kind that makes people forget they're in a restaurant, forget their wealth, their roles, their masks. The kind that reaches into your chest and squeezes something you didn't know was there. By the time she reached the nocturne's crescendo, her body swayed with the music. Her eyes remained closed. Her soul was speaking in a language no one in the room could fake. She wasn't asking for approval. She wasn't begging to be seen. She was commanding it, and everyone obeyed. She struck the final note, a whisper more than a sound, and let it hang. It lingered in the air like perfume, delicate and haunting. Then nothing, not a sound, not for 5 seconds. 10, and then applause. Loud, raw, earnest. People stood up. Napkins dropped to the floor. One woman cried. A man near the back whispered, "What did we just see?" Janelle opened her eyes slowly. Her hand still rested on the keys. She looked toward the bar and found Langston sitting back in his chair, eyes wide. His smirk? Gone. The last note had faded, but its impact lingered in the air like perfume in an empty ballroom. Bellevue was no longer a restaurant. It was a cathedral of silence, stunned by revelation. Diners stood mid-motion, unsure whether to sit or clap again. Waiters froze in the doorways. Even the bartenders stopped pouring drinks. And Janelle? She was still seated, fingertips grazing the keys, eyes half shut. Not in fear or shyness, but in something deeper, resolve. Then slowly she stood. The echo of the piano bench shifting was the only sound in the room. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She simply rose with the quiet strength of someone who had just reclaimed her identity after 3 years of burying it beneath napkins, wine lists, and the hollow cheerfulness of service work. She turned from the piano and began her walk back. A walk she'd taken many times before, but never like this. Every heel click on the marble floor sounded louder than applause. She passed by candlelit tables and wide-eyed millionaires who now looked at her with new, uncertain kind of respect. Their gazes no longer skimmed past her like furniture. They followed her every movement, but she didn't meet their eyes. She didn't need to. Her music had already spoken. As she walked, Flashbacks flicker across her mind like a film reel. Her first recital at Carnegie, where her mother sat in the third row, gripping a bouquet of lilies. The scholarship award letter with her name printed in gold. The day her mother collapsed at work. The diagnosis. The insurance denial. The decision that changed everything. She had walked out of her final conservatory exam to sit by a hospital bed. She had walked away from a career for someone who once walked miles to get her to piano lessons on time. She had walked these restaurant floors night after night, hiding her pain behind a polished smile. And now, she was walking back to her tray, with all of it exposed. No more hiding. The dining room watched in reverent silence as Janelle passed Langston's table. The man who had started it all, Dominic Langston, tech millionaire, king of arrogance, conqueror of headlines, sat with one hand still holding his wine glass, untouched. His posture had changed. His smirk was gone. What remained was something rare, uncertainty. He looked up at her as she passed. She didn't stop, didn't flinch, just walked by. But something in her gaze, calm, unwavering, piercing, hit him harder than any insult could. It wasn't hate. It wasn't rage. It was disappointment. And it cut deep. At his table, Langston's associates shifted uncomfortably. One cleared his throat. Another took a long sip of water. The loudest men in the room just an hour ago now looked like boys caught misbehaving at a funeral. Finally, Janelle reached the server's station, where her tray still sat, forgotten by all but her. She picked it up gently, like it was any other shift, but as she turned, she found her manager standing there. "Janelle," he started, eyes wide, voice quiet. She raised a hand. "I'm still on the clock," she said simply. He opened his mouth to respond, maybe to apologize, maybe to praise her, but then thought better of it. He just stepped aside. From the kitchen window, the head chef peeked through, eyes wet, nodding slowly as if he just witnessed something sacred. "Holy hell," whispered one of the junior servers nearby, still holding a basket of bread. She can really play. Back in the dining area, phones were still rolling. Footage of her performance had already started hitting social media. One caption read, "Millionaire mocks Black Waitress into playing piano. What happens next will leave you speechless." Another simply said, "Her talent left us in tears. Watch this." And it was true. The room had been split open, redefined. She wasn't just a Black Waitress anymore. She wasn't just a girl who played piano. She was a story. A moment of silence followed her as she made her rounds once more, refilling glasses, delivering entrees, checking in with guests. But something had shifted. Every "thank you" carried more weight. Every glance held something close to awe, not because she had shocked them, but because she had reminded them what grace looks like. And grace didn't whisper tonight. It roared. Across the room, Langston finally stood. He didn't speak. Not yet. He just stared at the piano, its black lacquer surface reflecting the golden light from above. He looked like a man facing his own reflection for the first time. A man used to winning, used to bending the world to his will, now bent himself by a performance he never saw coming. He stepped toward his seat again, but didn't sit. He needed a moment. Everyone did. At table 7, a woman dabbed her eyes with a linen napkin. At table 12, a man leaned toward his date and whispered, "She was at Carnegie? Why is she even here?" And near the bar, someone asked a question that would echo in every corner of the internet by morning. How many other talents are we stepping over every day because they're wearing aprons instead of suits? Janelle paused at the drink station, exhaled deeply, and looked toward the glass doors. Outside, Eastmere's skyline glowed like a theater backdrop, high-rises shimmering in defiance of the darkness around them. Inside, something deeper shimmered too. A crack had opened in the facade of power and privilege, and through it, real light was pouring in. Janelle's hands hovered just inches above the Steinway's ivory keys, trembling, not from fear, but from memory. The restaurant around her had faded. The low hum of conversation was gone. The clink of silverware and wine glasses ceased. Bellevue had become a theater, and Janelle stood alone in its spotlight. Her pulse thrummed in her ears. 3 years. 3 full years since her fingers last caressed piano keys. since she allowed herself to feel music, not just recall it in silence while folding napkins or polishing wine glasses. Her heart was thudding, not just because of the stunt Dominic Langston had pulled, but because she could feel her soul trying to claw its way back through her fingertips. The weight of the moment pressed on her chest, but it wasn't the pressure of performance. It was the gravity of everything she'd lost and everything she might reclaim. She took a breath and let her hands fall gently onto the keys. But she didn't play. Not yet. Her mind returned to a different place. It was spring, 3 years ago. She had just finished performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in the Carnegie Showcase. The applause was still echoing in her ears. Her professor had pulled her aside backstage. "You don't just play the piano," he'd said, his voice almost reverent. "You channel something ancient, like music remembers who it is through you." That was the last time she performed for an audience. Just weeks later, her mother collapsed on the apartment floor. Stage 4, medical bills, decisions, and suddenly, Carnegie Conservatory was in her rear-view mirror. Music didn't vanish. It was placed in a glass box and buried under responsibility. She had watched from afar as classmates went on to join orchestras when competitions toured the world, and she served drinks to men who couldn't remember her name. Tonight, one of those men had turned her into a spectacle, a joke, a dare, but something changed the second she sat down. The piano, the Steinway beneath her hands, wasn't just an instrument. It was a witness, a relic. It remembered every touch, every mistake, every triumph. It had been played by legends, and now it was hers for one night. Her fingers curled slightly. She pressed one note, B-flat. It rang out clear and still and perfect. A ripple moved through the room. She didn't glance at the crowd, didn't look for Langston's smug expression. She was gone from Bellevue now. Her spirit had taken flight, back to the practice rooms of her youth, back to the Carnegie stages, back to the nights her mother fell asleep on the couch while Janelle practiced scales at midnight. The next chord, then another, the beginnings of Chopin's Nocturne in B-flat minor. She played slow, deliberate, letting every note breathe. In the corner of the restaurant, a white-haired man leaned forward, brows narrowing behind wire-rimmed glasses. He tilted his head, as if recognizing a ghost. He watched not just her hands, but the way she swayed with the music, how she adjusted her posture mid-phrase. It wasn't performance. It was possession. And then the music swelled. The melody curled into the air like incense. It wrapped around tablecloths, drifted between glasses of Merlot, slid under chandeliers. Diners leaned in. Some placed their phones down mid-recording, as if ashamed to interrupt. Janelle's left hand pulsed the rhythm, solid and gentle. Her right danced, light as air, spinning the Nocturne's theme like silk thread. Her mind was lost now, not in fear, not in obligation, but in truth. She remembered everything. The bruise on her thumb from practicing arpeggios for 6 hours straight. The phone call from the Carnegie director, urging her not to leave. The night her mother whispered from her hospital bed, "If you never play again, I'll understand, but I hope someday you will." And now here she was, playing, not for tips, not for a dare, not even for redemption. She played for herself, and for the girl she once was, and for the woman she had become through pain, sacrifice, and silence. Each note now surged with emotion, rage, sorrow, pride. The middle section burst forward with intensity, her fingers blurring with speed and control. And still, not a single error, not one misbeat. She had trained too hard, too long, too precisely. This was what mastery looked like. Langston, still seated, had stopped speaking altogether, his wine untouched, his lips parted. Janelle's music had done what no reprimand ever could. It stripped him bare. In the face of her power, his arrogance looked small, petty, insignificant. This wasn't a waitress. This was a storm in a black apron, and she was reshaping the air. A man at table 14 wiped tears from his cheeks. A woman 2 seats away clutched her necklace like she was praying. The kitchen staff had all gathered in the back corridor, mouths open. Some were crying. One sous chef held her phone to her heart, like it could somehow record the feeling, not just the sound. As Janelle approached the nocturne's emotional peak, her whole body moved with it, not dramatically, but naturally, like her torso was another arm of the piano, guiding it, pulling music from the depths of her soul. And then, slowly, the piece softened. The high notes trickled down. The left hand faded into stillness. One final chord, suspended, then released. Silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It was holy, and for a full 5 seconds, no one breathed. Janelle kept her eyes closed, hands resting on the keys. Her chest rose and fell, a single tear slipping down one cheek. The room, frozen. And then, from somewhere near the bar, the first clap. It was soft, almost hesitant. Then another, then a dozen. Then everyone. A standing ovation burst across Bellevue. Rich men and women in $1,000 suits stood, clapped, cheered. Tears flowed freely. Voices cracked. And somewhere amid the applause, someone whispered the words that would echo through millions of screens by morning. Her talent left everyone in awe. The final note of Chopin's Nocturne in B-flat minor still shimmered in the air, like a breath held too long. Janelle Brooks didn't move. Her fingers hovered just above the keys, trembling. Her eyes stayed shut. In that moment, she wasn't a waitress. She wasn't a daughter stretched thin between shifts and medical bills. She was a woman who had just cracked open her soul in front of a room full of strangers, and something in her had changed. The applause had begun slow, hesitant, but now it had grown into a roar. Tables clattered as guests stood to their feet. Linen napkins fell to the floor, forgotten. Eyes shimmered under the restaurant chandeliers. Strangers smiled at each other through tears. For the first time all night, Bellevue felt unified, transfixed, reverent. Phones were recording. Streams were already live. It was no longer about a waitress who could play piano. It was a moment of reckoning. The millionaire, Dominic Langston, sat frozen at his table. His smirk had long vanished, replaced by an expression that hovered somewhere between stunned and ashamed. The challenge he had issued, as a joke, had flipped like a mirror. Now the reflection staring back at him was his own cruelty. He tried to raise his wine glass, but his hand shook. He set it back down without drinking. Janelle finally opened her eyes. She didn't scan the crowd. She didn't bask in their admiration. Instead, her gaze floated to a shadowed corner of the restaurant, where a familiar face now stepped into the light. It was Professor Harold Linwood, the former head of piano studies at the Carnegie Conservatory. He didn't clap. Not yet. He simply looked at her with eyes full of awe and heartbreak. Then softly he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, I know who she is." The room hushed again. 3 years ago, I watched those same hands perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 at Carnegie's Spring Showcase. And I remember thinking, I was witnessing the future of classical music. The diners turned to Janelle. Some audibly gasped. "Her name is Janelle Brooks," he said, voice rising now with pride. "And she wasn't just any student. She was our prodigy, our brightest flame." Langston's mouth twitched. His hand dropped to his lap. The irony curled around him like smoke. He had tried to humiliate a black waitress by asking her to play piano as a joke, and now the world watched as her talent left everyone in awe. She vanished in her second year. The professor continued. "We thought she transferred. Or quit. We didn't know. Her mother had fallen ill, that she walked away from it all to save someone else." A woman near the bar covered her mouth. A man beside her wiped away tears. Janelle looked down, her hands now folded in her lap. She didn't want their pity. She didn't need their praise. She just wanted them to know what this cost her, what it still costs her. Langston finally stood, slowly. His silk suit looked too tight now. His confidence had withered under the weight of his own actions. And as he stepped toward the piano, all eyes turned. Would he dismiss the moment? Would he try to spin it? He stopped a few feet from her. Janelle looked up. Their eyes met. No anger, no fear, just gravity. Langston cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was unsteady. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words echoed like thunder. What I did wasn't just disrespectful. It was cruel, thoughtless, and wrong. He took a breath. My mother was a waitress too, he said, his voice breaking. A black single mom who worked 2 jobs to get me through school. I've spent so much of my life trying to prove I belong in rooms like this one, I forgot what made me. The crowd was silent. I thought power meant control. That money gave me permission to treat people however I wanted. But I was wrong. He turned slightly, addressing the room now. Tonight, I tried to turn someone's dignity into entertainment. And instead, she reminded me what real power looks like. A beat, not wealth, not control, but grace and purpose. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the same stack of $100 bills he'd used to bait her. He looked at it, then tossed it onto the table like trash. $1,000? That's not an offer. That's an insult. Then he pulled something else from his wallet. A business card. This is my real offer. He handed it to Janelle. I know people at Mount Sinai. They have one of the best long-term care programs in the country. If you're willing, I'd like to help get your mother the treatment she needs. She stared at him. Her throat tightened. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was begging for redemption. A tear slid down her cheek, but she didn't speak. Not yet, because the music hadn't truly finished. The lesson was still unfolding. The power in the room no longer belonged to the billionaire. It belonged to the Black Waitress who had unleashed her talent not in defiance, but in truth, in honor of her mother, of her gift, of herself. The room hadn't breathed in over a minute. Janelle Brooks still sat at the piano, her posture poised, her chest rising and falling with a quiet tremble of adrenaline. The warmth of the keys lingered on her fingertips, but the true heat came from the stairs. Every pair of eyes in Bellevue was fixed on her, not with judgment, but revelation. She wasn't invisible anymore. Not a server, not a background blur. She had become something else. From the back of the room, Professor Harold Linwood stepped forward. His gray tweed coat brushed the edges of nearby tables. The glow from the chandelier kissed his white beard as he passed stunned diners, still holding half-sipped glasses of Merlot. Professor Linwood, firmly. I knew it. I knew those hands. The quiet cracked like thin ice. Janelle looked up. For a moment, she seemed to brace, like someone waiting for a blow they knew was coming. But then she saw who it was, and her shoulders relaxed just slightly. Professor Linwood, continuing, you didn't just play. You translated the composer's soul. That wasn't Chopin, it was you. Gasps echoed around the room as whispers took flight. Who is he? Is he from Carnegie? She studied music? She's a waitress? Professor Linwood. 3 years ago, this young woman stunned a panel of the finest musical minds in the country. At Carnegie Conservatory's Spring Showcase, she performed Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, and we sat in complete silence after she finished. Not because we were being polite, because we were changed. Janelle's eyes welled with tears. Her hand gripped the bench beside her. He wasn't exaggerating. She remembered the applause, the roses her mother had brought, the way her professors looked at her like she was the future, until everything unraveled. Professor Linwood, softly now. And then one day, she disappeared. His voice cracked slightly. No warning. No goodbye. 1 week. She was our brightest light. The next gone. And we never stopped wondering. What could have made Janelle Brooks walk away from music? Janelle stood now. Not tall, not proud, but honest. Her lips parted slowly. The moment asked for truth, and she gave it. Janelle, quietly. My mother got sick. You could have heard a fork drop. Her medical bills stacked up. There were home care costs, therapy sessions. The insurance barely covered anything. She needed full-time help, and I was all she had. A sharp breath somewhere near the fireplace. A woman reached for her partner's hand. Janelle, music could wait, but she couldn't. Linwood nodded, slowly, like each word she spoke carved something into him. Professor Linwood, your mother used to sit in the third row, every recital, always with lilies in her hands, always first to stand when you bowed. Janelle, smiling faintly. She called them my victory flowers. A chuckle rippled across the diners, light, touched with emotion. Even now, she continued, she listens to me play in her sleep. I sit beside her, put on headphones, and play old recordings on my phone. Her breathing slows. Sometimes she smiles. Someone near the bar wiped away a tear. The crowd, once dressed with luxury, now wore emotion like it was their only accessory. Janelle, glancing toward the untouched cash on Langston's table. I didn't come here tonight to make a statement. I came to make a living, to get through another shift, to keep her lights on. But when I looked at that piano, something inside me said it was time. She looked at Langston. You meant to humiliate me. I get that, but you didn't. Because this? She gestured to the piano. This is mine. Always has been. The applause rose again, not frenzied like before, but fuller, warmer, like the kind you give someone who earned your attention through truth. Dominic Langston, still standing, didn't interrupt. He didn't smile. He didn't posture. Instead, he stepped back and let her have the moment. Professor Linwood stepped closer, hand over his heart. Professor Linwood, would you come back, Janelle? Would you let us support you? You still have a home at Carnegie. You are Carnegie. She hesitated. The thought lit something in her. But there was still someone else she needed to think about. Janelle, softly, I can't leave my mom. Linwood, smiling, then let us come to you. From the other end of the restaurant, a woman in a dark green dress raised her hand. Woman, I work at the Silver Room. It's a concert hall in Eastmere. We'd be honored to feature you. A young couple at a nearby table turned. Groom T.O.B., we're getting married in 2 months. If you play at our ceremony, we'll triple your rate. Laughter broke through. Applause again. Then, from behind the bar, the manager stepped forward, his voice cautious but proud. Manager, Janelle, we've never seen anything like what you did tonight. If you want, we'd love for you to play here 3 nights a week, properly paid. No more serving tables. She looked around. The sea of strangers no longer looked like strangers. They looked like opportunity, like community, like change. Janelle's gaze drifted back to Professor Linwood. Janelle, you once told me, the music we hold back becomes noise. I didn't understand it then. Linwood, tearfully. And now, Janelle, now I hear it. The applause still echoed like gentle aftershocks through Bellevue. Diners were wiping tears, murmuring to one another, casting glances not at their plates, but at the young woman who had just turned a room full of cynics into believers. But now all eyes turned to him. He hadn't moved much since Janelle stepped away from the piano. The man who usually owned every room he walked into now looked like he wasn't quite sure how to breathe in it. He rose slowly, pushing back his chair with sound far too small for someone so used to booming entrances. Dominic, clearing throat. He hesitated. A full beat passed. I came in here tonight looking for a show. Silence again. No jokes. No smirks. No posturing. Just a man exposed. Dominic, that's what I do. I build companies. I break rules. I disrupt industries. I also apparently humiliate people. He laughed once, dry and bitter. It didn't land. Dominic, what I did tonight, it wasn't a joke. It was cruelty disguised as entertainment. And I've done it more times than I care to admit. He looked over at the table, where the crisp stack of bills still sat untouched. Dominic, quietly, $1,000 was an insult. He paused again, and this time, his voice broke slightly. Dominic, I forgot who I was, where I came from. Some in the room shifted, unsure what to expect. But Janelle stood firm, watching. Dominic, my mother was a waitress too. Black, proud. She raised me by herself. Worked 2 jobs. Took the bus through rain and snow, so I could go to a better school. She taught me about dignity, about humility. I used to be that kid who respected every person who brought water to my table. He glanced around the room, his face flushed now. And then I made money. A lot of it. And somewhere along the way, I traded gratitude for ego. I turned into the kind of man she'd never recognize. Dominic, to Janelle, you didn't just remind me of who I used to be. You reminded me of who I need to be. Janelle said nothing, but her expression had softened. The fire in her eyes cooled to something watchful. Listening, measuring. Dominic, I can't undo what I did, but I can start doing something that matters. He reached into his pocket, not for his wallet this time, but for a small white card. Dominic, I sit on the board of 2 major hospitals. One of them, Sterling Mount, has a program for advanced neurological care. They're doing breakthrough work with neurodegenerative treatment. Gasps fluttered from a few corners of the room. Someone whispered, "Isn't that one of the best on the East Coast?" Dominic, to Janelle, I don't want to throw money at you. I want to help your mom get into that program. Full coverage. No waiting lists. He extended the card to her. Dominic, softly, I've already made the call. They're waiting for your name. Janelle stared at the card in his hand, but she didn't take it. Not yet. Janelle, evenly. And why now? Why me? The question hung like a verdict. Dominic, sincere. Because for the first time in a long time, I was ashamed. Not because I got caught, but because I saw what real power looks like. It's not wealth. It's not reputation. It's grace and talent and choosing love over ego. He took a shaky breath. Dominic, you could have humiliated me tonight. You didn't. You just played. And that did more than shame me. It inspired me. He turned slightly, addressing the room now. Dominic, I've started a foundation before for tech outreach, but tonight made me realize what I've been missing. There are artists out there like Janelle, silenced by circumstances. That ends now. Phones rose. Journalists whispered. This was a moment they'd write about. Dominic, starting next month, we'll launch the Second Voice Initiative. Full scholarships for underprivileged musicians, performance grants, medical aid for artists caring for family. And Janelle, he turned back to her. I'd like you to help run it. Janelle's brows lifted slightly. Her lips parted. Janelle, I don't need pity. Dominic, shaking head. And I'm not offering any. I'm offering partnership. Because if we're going to elevate voices, it should start with yours. Janelle walked forward, finally taking the card from his hand. Janelle, softly, you don't get to fix this with one donation. Dominic, nodding, I know, but maybe it's a start. A quiet settled again. Not silence, but something gentler. Hope. In the background, Professor Linwood wiped his glasses. Linwood, gruffly, I taught thousands of students. Only a few changed me. Janelle was one of them. Maybe now she'll change the world. From the side, Bellevue's manager stepped forward. Manager, if this restaurant is going to mean anything going forward, I want her to play here. Not serve. Perform. A soft cheer erupted. Diners applauded again. And this time, when Janelle smiled, it wasn't tinged with fear. It was the smile of someone being seen. Heard. The piano sat untouched once again, but this time not in silence. It sat in reverence. Langston stood near the entrance, quietly thanking diners as they left. One leaned over and said, "You're not who I thought you were." He nodded. Dominic, to himself, "Neither am I." The sun had just dipped below the coastal skyline, casting gold-tinted shadows across the high-rises of Eastmere. Inside Bellevue, the atmosphere had shifted in ways both subtle and seismic. The buzz hadn't died down. If anything, it had grown. What started as a viral clip, a black waitress asked to play piano as a joke, only to reveal a talent that left everyone in awe, had transformed into something bigger than even Janelle Brooks could have imagined. Janelle sat across from Dominic Langston and Professor Linwood in a quiet meeting room adjacent to the main dining floor. Papers lay spread across the polished walnut table. Scholarship drafts, foundation mission statements, hospital contact lists. Dominic, we've already got 15 donors lined up, and 2 universities reached out asking if you'd speak to their music students. Professor Linwood, smiling, I always told you, you weren't meant to just play. You were meant to lead. Janelle, still dressed in black slacks and a modest blouse, ran her finger gently along the edge of the table, still trying to make sense of it all. Janelle, softly, I didn't plan this. That night, I just wanted to make it stop. The joke, the silence, the wait. She looked up. Janelle, I didn't think I'd start something. Dominic, but you did. That's what makes it real. He slid a folder toward her, stamped with the newly designed logo. Second Voice Initiative. Dominic, you're the face of it, not for PR, not for optics, because no one understands the stakes better than you. Janelle, what about my mother? Dominic, nodding. She stays your first priority. Always. The hospital's taking her in next week. Full evaluation. Full coverage. No waiting. Janelle leaned back, blinking slowly, fighting tears. Professor Linwood, you deserve this. Not because you played beautifully, but because you lived beautifully. Word had spread. And now, Bellevue had changed. 3 nights a week, the restaurant cleared a space near the piano and replaced a wine list with concert programs. Each featured new performer, young, talented, underrecognized, handpicked by Janelle, sponsored by the Second Voice Initiative. Tonight, a 19-year-old violinist named Malik performed a stirring rendition of St. Saëns. He had nearly dropped out of school the year prior. Now he played to a full house, with Janelle seated front row beside her mother. Her mother, once frail and near bedridden, looked stronger. The new treatments had begun. Her smile was slow, but radiant. MRS Brooks whispering, "You always belonged here." Dominic scrolled through a spreadsheet. Dozens of names, recipients, applicants, artists from underserved communities who finally had someone in their corner. A knock. One of his assistants poked in. Assistant, the Chicago Tribune. They want an op-ed from you on funding the arts. Dominic, smiling faintly. Tell them I'm not the writer they want, but maybe I can get Janelle to do it. Janelle stood in front of a modest crowd of young students. Many black and brown, some shy, others bold-eyed and eager. She didn't bring sheet music. She brought stories. Janelle, people will try to make you feel small. They'll say your art doesn't feed you, doesn't pay bills, isn't practical. She pauses, glancing down. But it saved me. She walked toward the piano behind her and sat down. One hand hovered above the keys, then slowly dropped into a gentle chord. Janelle, your voice matters, even if they try to turn it into a joke. She looked up, meeting every eye in the room. Janelle, firmly, make them listen. An elderly couple dined in the corner. A young TikTok star vlog from Table 6. News anchors whispered with a Broadway director. Not because of the food, though the truffle risotto was still impeccable. They were here for her, the former Black Waitress who had been dared to play piano as a joke, and whose talent had shaken the room. Now, her legend was becoming a lighthouse for others. Janelle adjusted her earpiece, took a deep breath, and walked out onto the stage. Spotlights. Applause. Behind her, a giant screen played the viral footage from Bellevue's infamous night. She stood at a podium as the final note faded on screen. Janelle, that night, I wasn't brave. I was tired. Tired of being invisible. Tired of being overlooked. Tired of pretending. Janelle, but that night gave me back something I thought I'd lost. My voice. And now, I'm going to use it to lift up every other voice they tried to keep silent. Applause thundered. Dominic sat alone, drink in hand, watching old home videos of his mother on an old camcorder. She smiled at the camera, apron around her waist, calling him in for dinner. MRS Langston on video. Be good to people, Dom. That's the only thing that makes all this worth it. He smiled, eyes misting. The man who once mocked servers now funded them, backed them, believed in them. Janelle closed the lid of the grand piano. She was the last one left. She reached into her bag, pulled out a worn sheet of music. Her first composition since returning to the keys. She placed it on the piano, signed it. To those whose voices were stolen, this is ours now. She turned off the lights. The soft amber lighting of Bellevue shimmered through its floor-to-ceiling windows, but tonight, something felt different. Not richer, not louder, just more human. The grand piano gleamed under the spotlight. Not just a centerpiece now, but a sacred space. Guests weren't simply eating tonight. They were waiting. At precisely 8 p.m., the room hushed. A familiar figure emerged from backstage. No longer in a waitress uniform, Janelle Brooks now wore a sleek black gown, elegant and understated. Her hair swept back, posture upright, presence commanding. She stepped forward as naturally as a queen would take her throne. MC VO gently into mic. Please welcome tonight's featured artist, Ms. Janelle Brooks. Thunderous applause rose, but it wasn't just loud. It was personal, the kind of applause that had memory in it. Seated closest to the piano, her mother beamed, dressed in a soft lavender wrap, healthier than she'd looked in years. The treatment funded by the foundation had worked wonders. Mrs. Brooks clutched a small bouquet of white daisies, the same flowers she used to bring Janelle at Carnegie. MRS, Brooks, whispering, "You came back stronger than ever." Tears shimmered in her eyes but didn't fall. Phones were already out, not to document gossip, but to preserve a moment, because the video from that night, the one where a millionaire dared a black waitress to play piano as a joke, had reached 28 million views. But tonight wasn't about that night. It was about everything after. Janelle sat on the bench and took one deep breath. Her hands hovered above the keys. Not trembling, not uncertain, just reverent. Janelle into mic. 3 months ago, I hadn't touched a piano in 3 years. I had stopped believing there was a future where music and caregiving could coexist. Janelle, but the thing about truth is, always finds its way back, even when buried beneath grief, fatigue, or fear, even when mocked. She paused, glanced toward her mother. Janelle, this performance is for those who were told they were too late, too poor, too invisible. It's for the voices muted in quiet rooms and loud systems. Janelle, smiling. Tonight, I played not because I was challenged, but because I was chosen. By the music. Again. The room leaned in. Then, she began. Soft, lush, poetic. The first notes floated like memory. Unlike the powerful, defiant Chopin from before, this piece was gentler, like a prayer whispered at midnight. Her fingers glided, as if reconnecting with an old language. The audience stilled, breath held in harmony with each note. From the kitchen to the balcony, from reporters to billionaires, there was no clinking of forks, no murmurs of wine pairings, just silence. Dominic sat next to Professor Linwood, eyes glassy, hands clasped. Dominic, softly, "She rebuilt something I thought I broke." Professor Linwood, watching, "You didn't break it. You revealed it." Dominic, "I just want to forget where I came from. I weaponized power the way it had been used on me." Professor, "And now," Dominic, "Now, I want to pass it forward, not as power, but as protection." At one table, the young couple who invited Janelle to play at their wedding smiled, holding hands. At another, a middle school violinist watched with wide eyes, her mother wiping a tear beside her. Near the back, 3 young men in Bellevue aprons, new staff, interns from the Foundation's mentorship program, stood still, witnessing the very future they'd once thought out of reach. As the final arpeggio fell, Janelle's hands lingered above the keys, not in hesitation, but in completion. She closed her eyes, bowed her head, and let the last note float away like smoke. Silence. And then, like a thunderclap, applause. Janelle stood and bowed. Then she walked directly to the edge of the stage, stepped down, and returned to her mother's side. Together, hand in hand, they rose. The room followed suit. Standing ovation. MRS. Brooks, smiling proud. You gave them music. But more than that, you gave them you. A conservatory student opens a scholarship letter. Second Voice Initiative, full ride. A struggling violinist in Detroit records her first studio session. A jazz pianist in New Orleans wipes tears at a Bellevue screening night. Janelle at middle school, helping a student adjust posture at a piano. Dominic handing over deeds, not for real estate, but for converted art spaces. The restaurant had emptied, the city humming outside. Janelle stood once more at the piano, alone now in the quiet. She placed her fingertips on the keys, but didn't play. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out a handwritten card. She left it on the music stand. It read, "To the girl who was mocked, who bent but didn't break. This is your stage now. Play forever." The lights of Bellevue glowed from its high-rise window like a beacon. Inside, the echoes of the night lingered, not just in memory, but in movement. Because a millionaire had tried to make a black waitress play piano as a joke. And her talent hadn't just left everyone in awe. It had left them changed. Forever. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button to follow more powerful stories like this. Like the video if Janelle's journey inspired you. Share it with someone who believes in second chances and hidden talents. And don't forget to turn on notifications, because the next story might just change the way you see the world.